At the height of their fame, the Sutherland Sisters were among the richest women in America. By the end, they were dead, institutionalized, or buried in unmarked graves. And somewhere in between, their story turned into something far more darker than any ghost story. History remembers the facts, but what about the phantoms that refuse to be forgotten? Welcome to the Dark Files. I'm Jeremy, the common historian, and this is where we strip away the legend and go straight into the darkness underneath. Today, we're going deep into one of the most bizarre, tragic, and generally eerie stories in American history, the Seven Sutherland Sisters. The story begins not in some grand Victorian parlor, but in the mud and poverty of a turkey farm in Cambria, Niagara County, New York. The Sutherland story traces back to 1810 when Andrew Sutherland came from Vermont and bought 136 acres of land on Ridge Road near Warren's Corners and built a log cabin. His son, Fletcher, would grow up there, become a Methodist minister, and marry a woman named Mary Brink, a musically gifted woman who would unknowingly set the entire legend into motion. Between 1845 and 1862, seven daughters came into their lives: Sarah, Victoria, Isabella, Grace, Naomi, Dora, and Mary Sutherland grew up penniless and barefoot on the same farm. Their mother held a particular fixation with their hair. She forbade them to cut it, and every evening slathered their heads with a foul smelling homemade ointment she believed would make it thick and strong. Apparently, she was right. The problem was the smell was so bad their classmates shunned them. These girls grew up isolated, different, marked by the very thing that would one day make them rich. Raised in poverty and shunned by local society, the Sutherland sisters shared two assets: musical talent and rich, thick hair. Fletcher, looking for a way out of poverty, decided to put both to work. The Sutherland children were all musically inclined and performed around New York State as the Sutherland Concert of Seven Sisters and One Brother. Brother Charlie, by the way, was eventually cut from the act. There was no interest in an adolescent boy with average hair. The sisters performed at fairs, churches, and local theaters, making their way up the circuit. But audiences weren't there for the music. By December 1880, they decided Broadway, where audiences gazed admirably at the girls' combined total 37 feet of hair. The act had a particular structure. The sisters would take the stage in white gowns, perform hymns and parlor songs, respectable, refined, almost church-like. And then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Their father would give the command, "Girls, let your hair down." The sisters would turn in unison, letting their voluminous tresses, a collective 36 and a half feet, spill down their back, over the crest of the stage, and into the orchestra pit. A gasp of amazement would sound through the audience, followed by thunderous applause. Victoria had hair 7 feet long. Isabel and Mary's hair was 6 feet long. Naomi's had hair 5 feet and a half long. Grace, 5 feet. Dora, four and a half. And Sarah's hair was 3 feet long. The shortest of the seven, which is why in every group photo, Sarah sat while the others stood. Mary, the youngest, was mentally unstable her whole life, and some doctors and preachers went as far as blaming her 6 feet of heavy hair pulling on her head. Their number seven, considered a holy biblical number, ascribed another level of mysticism to their act. Agents came knocking. In 1882, the sisters signed a deal to tour with W. Cole's colossal shows, and by 1884, the sisters had joined Barnum and Bailey's Greatest Show on Earth as a sideshow attraction. P.T. Barnum himself dubbed them the seven most pleasing wonders of the world. Fame was one thing, but Fletcher Sutherland saw something bigger. When Mary Brinks Sutherland died, she took the secret recipe for her hair tonic to the grave. Nonetheless, Bailey and Fletcher Sutherland wouldn't weren't about to let that small detail get in their way of of significant beauty product sales. They developed a product that promised to transform its users into beauties with extraordinary length of glossy hair. The result was called the Lucky Number Seven, Sutherland Sisters hair grower, also known as hair fertilizer. He sent a bottle to a chemist for an analysis and received a testimonial. I hereby certify that I have found it free from all injurious substances. It is beyond question the best preparation for hair ever made. In these days, before the FDA, that was enough. By the end of the year, the sales reached 90,000. That's roughly $3 million in today's money in a single year. The company expanded to include a network of over 28,000 dealers with business offices in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Toronto, and even Havana, Cuba. Their slogans were simple and effective. A woman's hair is her crowning glory. And remember, ladies, it's the hair, not the hat, that makes you beautiful. In a day and age when the rest of the country was just eking out of existence, the Seven Sisters achieved a gross revenue of 2.75 million during their 38 years in business. They were the 19th century's first celebrity models, and with the money came everything that tends to follow unchecked wealth. The Niagara County Historical Society states the house has 14 rooms, a marble lavatory with hot and cold running water, a turret, a cupola, and peak gables, beds imported from Europe, black walnut woodwork, hardwood floors, massive chandeliers, and well as an attic room for the cook and maids. The sisters were obsessed with pets. At one time, there were 17 cats and 7 or 8 dogs living in the mansion. When a pet died, it was buried in a pet cemetery behind the mansion in a special casket with a silver nameplate. They even invested $500, a small fortune at the time, to have a full funeral with a casket, flowers, and crypt on the door when a beloved dog passed away. The carriage horses were shod in gold. Maids were hired specifically to comb and detangle the sisters' hair every night. 7 life-size mannequin dolls were made in their likeness, dressed in Victorian finery, and sent to store windows to advertise their products, always to be returned to the mansion in the care of their personal maids. This was not wealth being managed. This was wealth being consumed. And then death came knocking. Naomi suddenly died in 1893 before turning 40, dramatically shaking the surviving sisters. The family planned to build a $30,000 mausoleum for her. The plans eventually were abandoned. Naomi's body lay in state at the mansion for a number of weeks. while construction was planned. She was eventually buried in the family plot without so much as a headstone. This was the moment, many historians believe, when something in the sisters began to fracture. Now enters the most gothic chapter of the entire story. As a young French nobleman by the name of Frederick Castlemaine came around to court the lovely Dora, but ended up marrying 40-something-year-old Isabella, who was more than 10 years his senior. He was charming. He was handsome. He had a morphine and opium addiction, and according to one account, the unnerving hobby of shooting the spokes out of wagon wheels from his seat on the Sutherland's front porch, paying off the angry farmers with cash. Frederick Castlemaine died in 1896 of an apparent morphine overdose. What happened next is something you generally could not make up. Isabella had a 1,400-pound hermetically sealed casket with a glass built on top, built for him. The casket remained in the mansion on Ridge Road for 2 weeks after he died. The sisters would play and sing his favorite songs and talk to him. After 10 days, the smell became so troubling, the local health officials stepped in and forced the family to bury him in a granite mausoleum at Glenwood Cemetery in Lockport, New York. But Isabella was not done. Even then, Isabella would walk the 3 miles to the cemetery every night, carrying a lantern to commune with her husband. At night, Isabella, dressed in white and carrying a lantern, would walk from her high street home to the Glenwood Cemetery, lean against the mausoleum, and weep. The sight of her at night in white, carrying a lantern, conveyed the image of a ghost to many of the children in the area. She wasn't a ghost, but she looked like one. And here is where folklore is born, not from the supernatural, but from grief so heavy it became indigestible from haunting. The mausoleum gained considerable local attention during its construction, and then again because of an attempted grave robbery. Grave robbery had been used, grave robbers had used both dynamite and powder in the attempt to blow open the door. When that failed, they gained entrance through a rear window, opened the outer box, pried open the top of Castlemaine's casket. Theories suggest they were either about after valuables believed to be inside or intended to hold the body for ransom. The culprits were never caught. The sisters continued touring with Barnum until 1907, but the 20th century was not kind to them. Victoria, even ever the beauty, finally married a 19-year-old man when she was 50. The outrage hurt sis that this outraged her sisters, who kicked her out of the mansion and ostracized her for the rest of her short life. She passed away at 53 in 1902. Mentally unwell, Mary grew increasingly antisocial. When she threatened her family with spells, her sisters would lock her in her room. When Sarah, the eldest, died in 1919, the family once again kept her body on display in the home and resisted burial. The same pattern as before, a grief that had curdled into something the outside world couldn't quite understand. Despite desperate for cash, the last three sisters went to Hollywood in 1919 on a trip so disastrous that not only did a movie deal fall through, but Dora was killed in a car crash. Grace and Mary returned to Cambria. The mansion was sold in 1931. On January 24th, 1938, the mansion burned to the ground, many taking many relics of the sisters' glory days with it. Mary ended up being committed at Buffalo State Asylum for the insane, where she died in 1939. Grace died destitute at age 92 in 1946. And as there was no room in her for her in the castle main mausoleum, she was buried in an unmarked grave. 7 women who had earned millions, 7 women who died with nothing. The Castlemaine Mausoleum still stands today in Glenwood Cemetery in Lockport, New York. Most of the Sutherland sisters rest there or near there, some in marked graves, some not. The mansion is long gone, burned to ashes, the hair tonic empire forgotten. But on certain nights, if you listen to local legend, some say a woman in white still walks the cemetery grounds, lantern in hand, weeping at a stone. That's probably just a story, but then again, Isabella did walk those 3 miles every single night for 2 years. Sometimes history doesn't need to invent its ghost. Sometimes the living do the job themselves. We look back on stories like this and ask where the hauntings begins. But maybe that's the wrong question. I'm Jeremy, the common historian. Remember, history truly never dies. It just finds new ways to haunt us. Till next time, keep digging into the darkness.